Against a black backdrop, the National Park Service arrowhead sits above the words Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park. This program is a virtual program and is filmed interview between two park rangers. Both sit in an office setting and discuss Reconstruction Era, during and after the war, and Sherman's Special Orders Number 15. We hope you enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a virtual program with Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park and a special guest that I'll introduce in just a second. My name is Park Ranger Jake Bowling, and today we are going to be talking with one of my colleagues in the National Park Service from Reconstruction Era National Historic Park, Mr. Chris Barr. Chris, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're at?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. First off, thanks for hosting us. As I said, my name is Chris Barr. I'm one of the park rangers here at Reconstruction Era National Historical Park. We're here in Beaufort County, South Carolina, and we're a fairly unique national park site. One that not a lot of people are super familiar with. This January 12th, 2022 will be our 5-year anniversary. We were just established in January of 2017. We're about halfway between Savannah and Charleston. And our park's story, our park's mission is we tell the story of the Reconstruction era everywhere in the United States, using what was happening here in Beaufort County, South Carolina, during and shortly after the Civil War is kind of a case study in that. A lot of the stuff that's going to become national Reconstruction were things that were being sort of experimented with here as part of what's called the Port Royal experiment. So we're excited to talk to you guys, Jake, about some stuff that's happening here in the region and how that might connect to you guys up at Kennesaw and talking about Reconstruction today.
Awesome, thanks. For the folks at home, so the reason I reached out to Chris was, number one, at this time in December of '64, Sherman has ended. Sherman has just a little recap of what's happened and kind of connecting us to Chris and his site down there. So Atlanta has fallen in September. Sherman's men occupy the city up until late November and then begin his march to the sea. Of course, the march to the sea would take Sherman and his men down through Georgia, ending at the coastal area in around Savannah. And because this is kind of the time period, and we have some other special things to kind of throw in there, this is kind of what's going on during our time in '64. We wanted to reach out to Chris. And so Chris, Chris and I were talking before, and what's happening on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina and Florida is a very unique situation, very different than what was happening further inland. Chris, would you tell us a little bit about the coast, the southern coast, during that time, during the Civil War?
Oh, absolutely. So kind of, I know with you guys at Kennesaw Mountain, y'all's story is, summer of 1864, the war has been grinding on for a few years. Well, our story here really begins almost as soon as the war begins. So, a lot of the Southern planter class that had been agitating for secession, those are folks that are from here on the South Carolina coast. And the South Carolina coast is, or was at the time, about 90% of the population was enslaved. And so, there's about 1,000 or so white people that lived here. There's about 10 to 15,000 enslaved people that lived on the Sea Islands right around Beaufort. And this same story is sort of true all up and down the coast, from North Florida down around Jacksonville, that area, really all the way up into sort of Wilmington. Today, what we would call, sort of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. So as part of the early Civil War military operations, the U.S. Navy sort of launches, or really the entire U.S. military launches, the famous Anaconda Plan, right? Blockade the southern ports. Well, two of your major southern ports in the Deep South are, of course, Savannah and Charleston. Well, Beaufort, and the islands around Beaufort are about halfway between those two. And the Confederates, for better or for worse, didn't have enough of a military strength or presence to try to defend all of these places. So Beaufort becomes the target. In November of 1861, right at the start of the war, just a few months after it began, the U.S. Navy sailed into what was known as the Port Royal Sound, or what is known as the Port Royal Sound. And so there's a naval battle here. For people that are a little familiar with the region, there were Confederate fortifications out at Hilton Head Island, and then also out at the end of what's called St. Helena Island, sort of guarding the waterways here. U.S. Navy attacks those. It's, to be blunt, it's not much of a fight. The Confederate garrison abandons those fortifications fairly quickly, Forts Walker and Beauregard. And as soon as that happened, as soon as the Confederates retreat, something unique happens. The white people that lived here on the Sea Islands right around Beaufort were very concerned about two things. One is, remember that these are some of the people that had agitated for secession. And so, they're a little, and this is really the first place in the Deep South that the U.S. military is captured. So they're a little concerned about what the U.S. military is going to do to them. They don't have sort of the model of occupation elsewhere. To be perfectly blunt, they're a little concerned that they're going to be punished for, the scary T word, for treason, which is not a word that we use a whole lot today to talk about the Civil War, but that's their concern. They're also very concerned, again, 90% of the population here is enslaved. They're very concerned about a slave revolt. So with those concerns in mind, the white people abandoned the islands right around Beaufort. So U.S. military comes ashore here to set up a supply hub out on Hilton Head. Here, I'm actually sitting in downtown Beaufort right now, here in downtown Beaufort, all up and down Port Royal Island. They were coming here to set up a supply hub to blockade the southern coast. Well, instead, they find 15,000 people looking at them and saying, what's next? Are we free? Are we still slaves? Who owns this land? Who do I work for? Do I work for myself? And so, this is so early in the war, there's not a plan in place. There's not a policy in place yet. And so what emerges becomes known as the Port Royal experiment, an experiment at sort of what does a post-slavery world look like? So they begin to, the Treasury Department comes in and begins to pay formerly enslaved people wages to work cotton fields, to work for the military. Working out on the docks and shipyards and warehouses. They begin to redistribute property, which is, I think, what we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes. They begin to say, well, if we've been the formerly enslaved people begin to say, well, we've been earning wages. Well, who owns this land? Well, why don't I own this land? Well, the position of the U.S. government at the time of the Civil War was that secession wasn't legal. So as far as they were concerned, these are abandoned lands that are now behind on their taxes. So they auction off all this farmland for unpaid taxes. So formerly enslaved people are able to purchase farmland, 5, 10, 15 acre plots all up and down the islands here around Beaufort. They begin to recruit black men into the Army. This is one of the first places where that's going to happen. The 1st South Carolina Volunteers, and their recruit depot is actually part of our park site and story today. It was called Camp Saxton. They begin to build schools. So this Port Royal experiment is sort of this multi-tiered. Again, it's sort of a social and political experiment at what post-slavery would look like. But at its core, this is still a military operation. And so when William Sherman concludes the March to the Sea, he's walking into a world that is, sort of well established, right? He's walking into it. He's coming into Savannah, and the black community in Savannah, they know what's been happening in Beaufort. They see Sherman and the guys walking in, and they're saying, hey, what's happening up in Beaufort? We want that to happen here too. And so on January 12th, 1865, Sherman actually had a meeting with some of the black leaders in Savannah. Incidentally, this was not on purpose, but incidentally, January 12th, the anniversary of that meeting is going to be the anniversary that this park is established in 2017. And so again, he's sort of walking into this existing world of that is experimenting with what does post-slavery look like. And so Sherman is a military guy, and so he sort of sees this and perhaps sees some opportunities militarily, and I hate to word it this way, but he's looking for a military excuse to sort of unburden himself of some of the refugees that have been following him across the South. And so to kind of dive in a little bit on that here, particularly after the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, after some of the confiscation acts are passed, for enslaved people throughout the South, they sort of recognize that wherever the American flag goes, freedom follows. And so as Sherman's troops are pushing across central Georgia towards the East Coast, word spreads, right? If you don't have to get to Canada to be free, you just got to get to wherever the Union Army is, wherever the U.S. Army is. Yeah, and so he ends up with sort of this column almost of enslaved people who are trying to liberate themselves and following him to get to the coast where there's maybe some opportunities. So that's sort of what's happening here when Sherman and his guys arrive in December of 1864 and into early 1865.
Awesome. And so, I loved how you said that, and you said it when we were having our conversation prior to the meeting here, and how Sherman is entering into this well-established world. And as you mentioned, a couple of things are happening. The folks in Savannah are saying, we know what's up in Beaufort, we know about the Port Royal thing, and we like that. And also, as you mentioned, as it's basically a mobile representation of the U.S. government is marching through Georgia, refugees are flocking to it. And so as a result of all of that stuff, and you mentioned the meeting on January 12th, well, kind of what, at least the focal point of what I wanted our conversation to mention was what happens on January 16th, 1865, just shortly after that, which would be Special Orders number 15. So, Chris, would you maybe elaborate on Sherman's Special Orders number 15?
Yeah, so, Special Orders number 15, it's one of those sort of military orders that a lot of people throughout the country, even if they aren't, quote unquote, Civil War buffs, have heard of. It's the 40 acres and a mule. So to sort of back up a little bit, as Sherman's column as they're marching across the Georgia, again, there's tons of refugees, formerly enslaved people or enslaved people who are, again, they're liberating themselves. They're taking that initiative to say, I'm going to take the risk and follow this army. And that puts, throughout history, there's sort of these things in conflict sometimes of sort of military necessity, but also sort of the social and political outcomes of the war sometimes butt heads. That comes to a head just outside of Savannah as some of Sherman's troops are crossing a body of water. Some of the guys, they literally sort of pull up the bridge behind them, trying to cut off
Ebenezer Creek.
Ebenezer Creek, trying to cut off sort of this refugee group that's following him, and a lot of those folks end up, getting re-enslaved or worse. But when they finally do get to Savannah, that sort of, word is spread. The black community there is sort of aware that Sherman does not have a reputation for being a friend to African American people, to sort of put that mildly. And so, they're sort of, these black leaders in Savannah are looking at Sherman going, look, we know about Ebenezer Creek. We know what's happening in Beaufort. But they also know they're already looking to the political outcome of the war. And in 19th century America, particularly in the South, property is power, right? If you go all the way back to the idea of, the old Jeffersonian ideal, right? The idea that, that people who own land are going to be somebody or be something. And perhaps nobody was more aware of that than the people who had themselves, in the eyes of the law, been considered property. And so that's sort of the number one thing that people, as they sort of leave a condition of slavery and move into a condition of freedom, they almost universally start to say, well, we need land. If we're going to make this, if we're going to become a part of this American society as equals, as citizens even, we're going to need property. And so sort of with Ebenezer Creek in mind, with this idea of thinking about the end of the war in mind, they go to Sherman and say, look, we need you to do something about this. And Sherman, as a military commander, has a little bit of leeway. And so he issues, Special Orders number 15, which essentially stipulates that, thousands of acres of land stretching from the coast of sort of North Florida all the way really up to about Charleston or so, and stretching about 30 miles inland, are to be confiscated and distributed to formerly enslaved people. And there's in the orders it sort of spells out, like how many people had to be there and that kind of thing. And then, oftentimes this is going to be 40-acre plots, and we're going to give you an army mule as well. So that's where sort of this 40 acres and a mule comes from. And so after the war, this is going to become emblematic of sort of the problems of Reconstruction on a national scale, is that Reconstruction is not going to work if black people don't own property. And so they look to Special Orders number 15 and say, look, we've been promised 40 acres and a mule. This is going to be our path to citizenship. This is going to be our path to prosperity. This is going to be our path to equality. And for at least a little while, that's going to kind of work. Now, one thing I do want to note in Special Orders 15 is it does sort of carve out a couple of spaces. It does sort of, exempt isn't the right word, but it does sort of carve out sort of an exception regarding Beaufort. Because remember, the people here in Beaufort had already purchased the land. And so that ultimately is going to sort of illustrate the failure of Special Orders 15 and, ultimately why President Johnson, almost a year later, sort of rescinds Special Order 15. And that has to do with this idea of abandoned land versus confiscated land. What is the nature of the war? What is the legality of secession, right? The position of the U.S. government, I said this earlier, was that secession isn't legal. As far as the U.S. government was concerned, as far as the Lincoln administration was concerned, every single Confederate is still an American citizen. They're just sort of breaking the law almost in a sense, or just sort of not in sort of their normal relations, is I think how Lincoln always worded it. That there was no such thing as a Confederate States of America. And so when that land is abandoned, they're able to use that idea of abandoned land to then sort of legally distribute that through tax auctions. It's really no different from today. If you, like Jake, if you decided you were going to stop paying your rent or your mortgage or stop paying your taxes, I mean, somebody's going to show up from your county government and they're going to auction off your house. Same concept. And so, within Special Orders 15, it basically says, now we're not going to confiscate the land that's already been bought. That we're not going to confiscate that abandoned land that's already been bought and sold at these tax auctions. Those people are going to keep their land. Well, fast forward to after the war, and the white Southern planter class, or even just the white landowner class, even not even the super wealthy planters, sort of take that view of secession to their advantage to regain their lands. If the position of the U.S. government is that secession isn't legal, well,
then we never abandon, almost like,
if you never abandon it, right? If you're some farmer who's, say, in East Georgia, let's say you're a farmer in Bullock County, Georgia, or Screven County, Georgia, and you never abandoned your land, and the government suddenly comes in, the army confiscates your land and gives it to former slaves. Well, then after the war, you can sort of go to the courts, or you can go to President Johnson and say, look, you guys were saying secession never happened, that I'm still an American citizen. You have confiscated my property without due process. And Johnson and sort of his supporters, the people who are opposed to this sort of progressive view of Reconstruction, look at it and say, you know what, you're right. And they essentially reconfiscate the confiscated land from the formerly enslaved people and give it back to the planter class. And so, again, that sort of creates this sort of chicken or the egg discussion about, where does, the league, there's sort of what the law says, and then sort of what is sort of the spirit of what the outcome of the war is. By sort of confiscating the land, by not following through on this 40 acres and a mule, it sets the stage for essentially, generations of sharecropping and things like that. Because again, in 19th century American South, land ownership is power. Land ownership is going to be your path sort of to prosperity. And so again, the Special Orders 15 is certainly something a lot of people are very familiar with, even if they don't know necessarily the name Special Orders 15. You'll see it pop up today, even today, in sort of political discourse about, that 40 acres and a mule. The government promised this, and the government reneged on this promise. And so, so it's certainly, this idea of land ownership after the war is arguably one of the most important conversations we can have about Reconstruction.
Absolutely. And thank you for that, Chris. Thank you. That was awesome. And, kind of what Chris said, there was a brief thing that he said, if you guys caught it, and where he said that, well, a lot of things he said, I hope you caught all of them, but he mentioned that this kind of back and forth, the chicken or the egg, and this land, kind of the government reneging on this on this promise very shortly after. And one of the big things that does happen during the Reconstruction that we kind of associate is setting up the system of sharecropping, is setting up a lot of what we would, really the nexus of of things that would evolve into, the military leaving the South, the black codes, the Jim Crow laws, and then we get to segregation, and the list goes on. And my point being is that the important part about historic places, whether it be, Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park or Reconstruction Era National Historic Park, is seeing the connection between these and seeing their place in American history. And that's really the purpose of the program today, was to really, to talk about and discuss the upcoming because the anniversary of the issuance of Special Orders 15 is coming up in January, and really to discuss the connection between these two places, albeit fairly distant geographically. And Chris sets up in a couple of our other conversations about Reconstruction, where if you look at a history book, Reconstruction Era, has kind of a very firm block. But Chris, what did you say? You said Reconstruction starts anywhere the Union Army is and the Confederate Army isn't. Is that I'm paraphrasing that?
Yeah. So typically, if people sort of remember Reconstruction from their high school history class, if it was discussed, it was probably a very firm, like, okay, it's the end of the Civil War until the election of 1876 and the inauguration of Rutherford B. Hayes, and the so-called corrupt bargain and all that kind of stuff. But realistically, Reconstruction is, or was rather, sort of the process of emancipation, right? The United States, particularly in the southern states, but not exclusively in the South, had effectively been an economy and a society rooted in the enslavement of people of African ancestry, going back into the early 1600s. If you're talking about the English colonies, earlier than that, if you want to talk about Spanish explorers moving through the area, a lot of those Spanish conquistadors moving through the southeast had enslaved Africans with them as well. This had been sort of part of the American fabric for about 250 years or so before the Civil War, and that's not something that's going to just turn off overnight. Right? It's something that it's a process. And so that's ultimately the story of Reconstruction, is how do we reconstruct what the United States was? How do we reconstruct the political system, the economic system, the social system? Can't just flip a switch and say suddenly, all right, well, cool, 4 million people, you're now free, you're citizens. I mean, you can, but there's going to be resistance to that. And that's where we see groups like the Klan and the Red Shirts here in South Carolina rise up to sort of resist that. It's a process. And so we sort of say Reconstruction is, again, the process of emancipation, the process of transitioning from slavery to freedom. And that's a process that began here during the Civil War in Atlanta. For you guys, like, that's going to be a process for the enslaved population of Atlanta. That's a process that begins in September of 1864 when the Confederates abandon the city and the Union Army marches in. Up in Chattanooga, that's a process that begins in November of 1863 when the Union Army captures the city and the Confederates retreat, headed down your way. In Murfreesboro, Tennessee, kind of moving up the Park Service corridor here. That's a process that's going to begin in December of 1862 and January of 1863. And so, when Reconstruction begins, it really begins sort of during the war. And then where it ends is sort of an open-ended question. The Park Service here in Beaufort, we sort of define Reconstruction as ending right around 1900 with the rise of Jim Crow laws and sort of the ending of this experiment on sort of governance and political systems to support the transition out of slavery. But in some places, it ends much faster than that. When sort of the pre-war political class was able to sort of take back control, we can say, well, Reconstruction ended there. So, for example, in my hometown, we can make the argument Reconstruction ends in like 1869, 1870 when the Klan goes in and burns everybody out. But here in Beaufort County, Reconstruction is a much longer story. So sort of our Park Service time period is we go 1861, 1862 with the dawn of the Port Royal experiment all the way till about 1900 or so.
Outstanding. Well, Chris, I want to say thank you so much for giving me some of your time today and having this discussion with us, folks. And I'll tell you, the story doesn't stop there. If you're watching this on our social media, then you're a fan of Kennesaw Mountain, and maybe you come and visit us so you know where we're at and what we're all about. Just briefly, Chris, and then we'll wrap up. If someone wanted to come and visit you and the park, Reconstruction Era down in Beaufort, what's the best way to do that? What are your hours? Yeah.
So officially, our park has 3 different areas. In downtown Beaufort, we've got a welcome center. If you're a little bit familiar with the town, we're right across the street from the Beaufort Arsenal. Matter of fact, I'm actually sitting in the Beaufort Arsenal right now, trying to find a semi-quiet room to hop in and talk to you. But we've got a little small welcome center that's here in downtown Beaufort. Out on St. Helena Island is the campus of the Penn Center, which is one of those early schools that was established for formerly enslaved people. It was established in 1862, and it remained an active school all the way till the late 1940s and 50s. And after that, it became a community center. It was actually a retreat center for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Martin Luther King Jr. was out there a whole bunch, and that kind of thing. We've also got a site called Camp Saxton, which was a recruit depot for black soldiers. That's down in Port Royal. And we've got a little contact station down there that's right across the street from Naval Hospital Beaufort, which is where some of those core Camp Saxton sites are located, is actually within the Naval Hospital. We've got a great relationship there with the Navy, the town of Port Royal, for us to be able to have a little bit of a presence down there. So anybody looking to visit, stick your head at the door at any one of those 3 sites. Because we are a fairly new park, I hesitate on this video to say exactly what our hours are, because we're always hoping to expand our operation here. Right now we're open Tuesdays through Saturdays from 10 to 4. And so, as a new park under development, come back and come see us soon, but then also come back and see us later, because every time you come back, something is going to be different here.
Absolutely. And, every time you come back, you get a different chunk of the story, right?
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Chris, and ladies and gentlemen that watch this. Thank you for tuning in with us, and we will see you at one of these awesome National Park Service areas sometime in the future. I hope everyone has a wonderful holidays, and thanks again, Chris.
Thank you.